Mr Hunt, just a handful of further questions. However, the first matter I'm just going to raise is something I'm not going to ask you any particular questions about now, but I just want to flag it up. In the bundle of documents which the inquiry provided to you, there are 2 letters written by a team within HM Treasury. We'll just put them very briefly on screen so that we're talking about the same thing, but I'm not going to go through them. So it's COLL 5026 and then 5027, I think, Lawrence. Mr. Hunt, these are not letters that were sent by you, and the letters to which they respond are undoubtedly not letters that were ever seen by you. But just to give context, Mr. and Mrs. Turton are the parents of a young son who was infected with HIV and died of AIDS, and Lauren Palmer is a young woman, both of whose parents were infected with HIV and died of AIDS. Now, I've been asked to ask a number of questions about the way in which these letters were written and what might be said the somewhat soulless and dispassionate tone and language used. But having discussed it further with their representatives and indeed with your own, it seemed a more sensible way forward, rather than me ask you to analyse these now, is if a letter is sent to you via your legal representatives, setting out why it was these letters were seen as so hurtful, whether that could be something that is seen directly by you and sent directly to you. So that's the way we're going to proceed. But for the benefit of I know, of what maybe Mr. and Mrs. Turton and Ms. Palmer listening, I wanted to make that clear.
Okay, thank you.
So if we can take those down now. So then the next issue relates to the question I asked you about the possibility of registering those who are not currently registered with the schemes. And I think as part of your answer, you pointed to the possibility that there might need to be new organisations established, and then you referred to some of the complexities involved in relation to that. Could we look at INQY 40453, please, Lawrence, which is the Chair's second interim report. And if we go to page 61, so this is part of what is recommendation 12, the recommendation of £100,000 interim payment. And if we pick it up in the second paragraph, it's to recognise the deaths of people to date unrecognised and thereby alleviate immediate suffering. And then that set out parents, children and siblings. And if we could just go to the next paragraph, you'll see that the inquiry report said these interim payments should be capable of being made through the support schemes after registration and of being achieved reasonably quickly. They can and should be achievable before the compensation scheme itself is operational. So the inquiry's recommendation is that in relation to these individuals, this doesn't need a new organisation. This can be done through the existing support schemes. Is that something the government understands?
Yes, and I'm sorry if my previous answer wasn't clear, but this is one of a number of the recommendations made in the second interim report that we are still reflecting on carefully, and that's why we're not in a position to make any decision or announce any decision today.
I just wanted to be clear that the registration wouldn't require new schemes. And then if we go back to the paragraph above, which I referred to, you'll see the recommendation is not an interim payment of £100,000 to every individual relative who falls within the category set out. It's a recommendation of a payment to recognise each death. And I think you referred in your earlier evidence to the uncertainty that there might be about the numbers who might be eligible in that regard. And so I just wanted, if we may please, to go to INQY 0000454. This is the inquiry's summary of the key findings of its statistical expert group. And if we could go to page 3, please, Lawrence. You will see, bottom half of the page, deaths during 1970 to 2019 attributable to infected blood or blood products. And then a number of general matters set out about the statistics expert group's approach. And then this in the last paragraph. The experts therefore conclude that around 2,900 deaths during 1970 to 2019 are attributable to infections from blood or blood products in the UK, although there is considerable uncertainty about this estimate. But that's the figure, the estimated figure in relation to deaths. I think you referred to it yourself in your earlier evidence. Now, if there are a number of deaths that have already been recognised by the making of an interim payment. That's the interim payments that were made to bereaved partners, around 900 or so. So that would leave currently around 2,000 deaths that have been unrecognised to date through the making of any kind of compensation payment. So it may not be correct to suggest that there is no sense of how many further interim payments would fall to be made if recommendation 12 is accepted, because it's a recommendation of a payment for each thus far unrecognised death, not for each relative. Does the government understand that, do you think?
It does, but there are, as I understand it, other recommendations about affected people that we are also being asked to consider, and we want to consider all of those together.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There are then broader recommendations in terms of the structure of a final compensation scheme. It really, and I appreciate you've talked about wanting to consider everything together. It really goes back to the point I explored with you earlier, Mr. Hunt, about whether there are some decisions that could be taken in advance of others. Because, for example, payment in relation to deaths as yet unrecognised would not commit the government to making payments to a wider category of relatives. That's understood, I hope, by the government.
It is understood, but we do want to take all these decisions together and as quickly as possible.
Can I then just pick up on the question of arm's length bodies? You talked about it, certainly, I'm not sure whether you said it was unique or whether just unusual to have an arm's length body that doesn't, that reports directly to Parliament.
Novel, I think.
Yes. I'm asked to point out that there are, for example, two examples, the National Audit Office and the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, both of which report directly to Parliament.
Yes, I mean, that is true, but I think this would be substantively different to those two bodies.
And then the ALB model, I mean, there are a range of different ways of ALBs, but Sir Robert, for example, gave examples of the Care Quality Commission, described as fiercely independent but funded by government. So there's not a single way of doing it.
No, but as I understand his recommendations, this was a body that would decide an amount of compensation. That isn't what the Care Quality Commission do. So there is, without passing any judgment on the recommendation, we want to give it full thought, but it would be a different constitutional arrangement to one that I think we've got elsewhere.
The final area for questioning is this. You have said in your evidence you recognise how long this community has been waiting for justice. And I am reminded that the fifth aspect of the moral duty discussed by Sir Robert Francis in his report recognised the specific roller coaster of raised and then dashed expectations with regard to support and recognition of their plight. In other words, part of the moral duty, which, as we understand it, the government has accepted, is directly tied to the delays that the community has experienced over the decades. In other words, the injustice upon injustice heaped upon the original infections and their circumstances. Do you accept that the ongoing period of time, delays, and lack of information is creating an ever greater moral duty?
Every day that we take longer than necessary is a day too long. I absolutely accept that. The refusal to accept that there was any state responsibility in this, and therefore no moral justification for compensation, most certainly put salt in the wounds of people who were already having an unbelievably tough life as a result of this scandal. I fully accept that. So, yes, I totally agree with Sir Robert that we do have a moral duty to resolve this as quickly as we possibly can.
And the final point I'm asked to point out to ascertain that it's fully understood and taken into account as part of the decision-making process, particularly in terms of timing, is this question of injustice continuing to be compounded. You use a phrase in your statement, historic injustice. Others would say it's not historic, it's still a present and continuing injustice. And that there are many who, even those who receive the interim payments, are still in a position of financial uncertainty, of not being able to plan, of not being able to know where they are going to be. And of course, those who have received no interim payments have a position of considerable uncertainty. So that the injustice, that the harm is compounded every day it takes, is something which I have been asked to convey to you and ask, is that properly understood by each and every official, each and every minister dealing with this issue?
Well, I believe it is understood by the ministers and officials involved that this has taken far too long to resolve. It is a terrible scandal, and we have a moral duty to resolve it as quickly as we possibly can, and not to make the injustice worse by adding in further unnecessary delays. It is very hard to explain to people in this context that there are still things as a government that we have to do before we can resolve something of this magnitude. But I do believe that the necessary work is happening at the moment in order for the government to come to a conclusion of this. And that's why we're not waiting until you conclude your inquiry before doing all this work. And as soon as you have concluded it, we will have, I hope, done enough work to be able to come to a solution and publish that solution as quickly as we possibly can.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask from those put forward by core participants. I'm just going to check. Mr. Skelton for Mr. Hunt has no questions. Do you have any questions for the Chancellor, sir?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Mr. Hunt, is there anything you wanted to add?
I don't think so, thank you.
Well, there is something I'd like to add, which is to thank you. The first and perhaps the minor matter in some respects, for which I would like to thank you, is for being prepared to come at relatively short notice on a Friday of all days, in the afternoon of all times, to give evidence. But the major part of it is to thank you for the tone in which you have given your evidence, and the way in which that may have helped to explain to those of us who've been listening in a way that has not been clearly explained before, why the commitment to compensation, what the Prime Minister described as one of his priorities, has not yet come to any form of tangible fruition. I'd just like to add, if I may, this is not a question, it's really a request. Straight after the break, Council took you to part of the interim report where I dealt with the position of people who have died, leaving bereaved parents, or where the child has lost a parent or both parents, and suggested that in respect of that death, there should be interim payments. Now, I appreciate that it's part of everything that you put together. You've explained why it is that government is taking its time over that. But time is corrosive. Delay is corrosive. And it may be that as your discussions progress, you can't say anything about that, I fully appreciate, But as discussions progress, you find yourself in a position to make interim payments, even in advance of seeing the whole scope of whatever scheme it is that you may have in mind to give fair and just compensation which people deserve. So would you consider at least doing that if the opportunity arises, and so far as you can, help the opportunity to emerge to do that?
Can I say I will reflect on what you've said carefully, Sir Brian?
Thank you very much.
So that concludes this witnesses' evidence, and it concludes this week's hearings.
Well, I think I said at the end of the last set of hearings that we had that we did not anticipate having any more hearings. I didn't say absolutely that we wouldn't. And you've seen that we have this week been exploring the nature, the adequacy, and the timeliness of the government's response. It remains for me to reflect on what has been said, and I've no doubt you will too, but thank you for your attendance. Given what's been said, I shall do everything I can to make sure that the final report is produced as quickly as I reasonably can. It won't, I think, be early in the autumn, but I can't say any more about it. I shall do my best. But thank you.